They say neighbors can either be a blessing or a curse. And in the 12th century BCE, Egypt found out the hard way what it really meant when those guys from next door decided to move in permanently. Imagine a house party that never ends, guests who start rearranging your furniture, and suddenly everyone's wearing leopard skins and speaking in a dialect you can't quite follow. Welcome to the Egyptian New Kingdom's great, unscripted crossover episode, The Libyans Are Coming. But before you start imagining war chariots blazing across the desert like Mad Max meets the Nile, you should know, this isn't your average story of conquest. Oh no. This is the tale of quiet encroachment, of bureaucratic headaches, of one pharaoh's chronic eye twitch whenever a Libyan envoy spoke just a little too slowly. It's the story of family feuds, fashion drama, and how you can lose your country's throne to a guy who smells vaguely like goat milk and insists on building round huts in the middle of your rectangular courtyards. Let's rewind a bit. The Egyptians had always seen themselves as the peak of civilization. A beautifully eyelinered people chosen by the gods to rule the world, or at least the bit around the Nile. So when a bunch of Libyan clans, desert nomads with wild hair, way too much confidence, and a deep love for wearing feathers started popping up more and more along Egypt's western frontier, it didn't raise immediate alarm bells. At first, it was cute. Look at these adorable pastoral tribes, some Egyptian official probably said. They just want to graze their cattle and maybe worship the sun sideways. Let's let them settle a bit west of the Delta. What harm could they possibly cause? Fast forward 50 years. Who gave them pyramids? The migration of Libyan groups like the Meshwesh and Libu into the Nile Delta wasn't some massive invasion. It was more like a slow, passive-aggressive colonization, like if your cousin came over for a weekend and 2 decades later was still living on your couch, calling your dog ours, and changing the channel during Game of Thrones reruns. Libyans, of course, had their own charm. They brought with them impressive archery skills, interesting tattoos, and a tendency to name their children things that sounded like sneezes. They were hearty, family-oriented, and had zero respect for Egyptian bureaucracy, which meant border guards constantly had to ask, are you here for trade, migration, or are you starting a kingdom today? The Egyptian scribes did their best to keep up. Day 4 of the season of flooding. Another group of Meshwesh entered the Delta, built a goat enclosure beside the Temple of Bastet, and demanded voting rights. One of them gave my cat a haircut. Pharaoh Ramesses III, may the gods bless his stressed soul, tried everything. Military campaigns, diplomacy, tighter border control, even commissioning a series of threatening hieroglyphs that basically said, no shirt, no shoes, no settling. But the Libyans were stubborn, persistent, and oddly immune to passive aggression. They just stayed. And then they started integrating, which is a polite way of saying they married in, bought property, and somehow made their way into the Egyptian military and government structure. Before long, Libyan warlords were sending their sons to Egyptian schools, bribing priests, and asking why their taxes didn't include flood insurance. Egyptian nobles were aghast. They don't even bother with wigs, one high priest was overheard saying. They just grow their hair out like animals. Yet despite all the eye rolls and scandalized gasps, the Libyans were gaining power. By the time Egypt entered its third intermediate period, a polite term for we lost control of everything, Libyan families were sitting on thrones and running provinces like they owned the place because Well, they kinda did. And that's where the story really gets good. Stick with this tale, dear reader, or better yet, viewer, because this isn't just the story of one civilization slowly absorbing another. It's a reminder that history doesn't always march in with swords and trumpets. Sometimes it knocks politely, asks if it can water its goats in your backyard, and 30 years later hands you a birth certificate that says King Asorkon II. So if you've ever had to deal with a pushy neighbor, a cousin who won't leave, or a roommate who slowly starts labeling your Tupperware as their congratulations, you already understand Egyptian foreign policy better than most scholars. Stay tuned, because next we'll meet a Libyan who didn't just settle in Egypt, he became Egypt. His name, Shoshenq. And if you think Shoshenq sounds like someone who'd ruin your pottery class by asking too many questions, you're right. But he also happened to take over the entire country and make it look easy. How did a feather-wearing foreigner become Pharaoh of Egypt? Why did Egyptian priests suddenly start speaking with desert accents? And how did the god Amun feel about sharing his temples with guys who brought their own lawn chairs? You're about to find out. By the time Shoshenq sauntered into Egypt's royal court with his swaggering feathered hat and impeccable tan, the place was already halfway to becoming a family reunion for Libyan clan heads. Egyptian nobles who once raised eyebrows at the sight of those Westerners marrying into the elite now found themselves attending weddings where the bridal march was played on goat horns and everyone drank fermented camel milk. Egypt, exhausted from internal power struggles, priestly tantrums, and a collective midlife crisis called the Third Intermediate Period, was basically begging for anyone to just take control and keep the river taxes flowing. Shoshenq, the son of a Libyan military commander who'd risen to prominence under the previous dynasty, was the perfect storm. Part outsider, part insider, all ambition. He had the lineage, the military connections, and a name that sounded like a cat coughing up a scroll. And unlike previous pharaohs who were obsessed with building temples and yelling at the sun, Shoshenq was focused on what really mattered: paperwork, priests, and power consolidation. Sexy, right? But don't let the admin-heavy agenda fool you. This guy was a showman. Picture a man who entered every temple like it was a runway, robes flowing, chin high, eyeliner on point. He didn't just become pharaoh, he made it look like destiny. He even claimed to be chosen by Amun himself, which was bold, considering Amun hadn't texted anyone back since the Ramesside period. Now, imagine the poor scribes trying to keep up. Royal Scribe Log, Year 1 of Pharaoh Shoshenq's reign. Today, His Majesty declared a holy tax holiday, wrestled a crocodile for sport, and renamed 3 districts after his cousins. Also, he wants the statues to have more Libyan cheekbones, whatever that means. What made Shoshenq really dangerous wasn't just that he was efficient, it was that he understood both sides. He could speak priest and warlord. He knew when to flatter and when to threaten. And he had a killer instinct for drama. When he marched into Jerusalem during one of his campaigns, yes, that Jerusalem, he looted the Temple of Solomon and made sure everyone knew who the new top godfather was. This was ancient PR at its finest. And the Egyptian elite, they weren't happy. One priest was overheard whispering, "I studied the Book of the Dead for 20 years, and now I answer to a man who thinks hieroglyphs should be drawn with more muscle definition." But the thing is, it worked. For a while. The rest of the Libyan clans saw what was happening and thought, hey, if cousin Shoshenq can do it, so can we. And suddenly, the Delta region turned into the ancient equivalent of a Libyan HOA meeting. Everyone wanted their own little piece of the pharaonic pie. Regional governors, military leaders, even glorified goat herders started calling themselves great chiefs of the Ma, rulers of the two horns, or just definitely not a threat to national stability. We swear. The Egyptian administration was struggling to hold it all together. Worse, the temples, those grand halls of order and divine legitimacy, became battlefields of cultural aesthetics. Traditional Egyptian priests insisted on long-standing rituals, sacred silence, and incense wafting gently through lotus-shaped halls. Libyan priests, on the other hand, preferred brisk prayers, shouted mantras, and an occasional interpretive dance. One infamous incident involved the Temple of Amun at Karnak, where a Libyan high priest rewrote the hymn to include his grandfather's name, and his grandfather wasn't even dead. That's like crashing a funeral and giving your resume as the eulogy. You'd think the average Egyptian peasant would be up in arms about all these changes, but no. They had bigger problems like floods, taxes, and that one goose that wouldn't stop hissing near the market stalls. Still, they noticed the shifts. Libyan hairstyles became trendy, if slightly itchy. Feathered capes made a comeback, and in households across the land, dinner arguments began with, "You're acting just like your Libyan side of the family," which, depending on the region, could be either a compliment or a reason to sleep in the storage granary. The transition wasn't smooth. Egyptian architecture was all about order, balance, and symmetry. Libyan additions, wild curves, extra towers, and so many feathers. The palaces started looking like Vegas theme parks. One scribe famously wrote, "This new library design is an affront to Thoth." Also, someone replaced all our scrolls with goat recipes, and don't even get them started on funerary practices. The Egyptians had perfected the art of mummification over thousands of years. The Libyans? Let's just say their version was more experimental. One failed embalming ended with a noble accidentally being smoked like beef jerky. But the biggest complaint? The music. Traditional Egyptian music was elegant, flute-based, and ceremonial. Libyans brought in percussion, horns, and what one noble described as rhythmic chaos. Imagine trying to meditate on eternal life while someone outside your tomb is playing battle drums and yelling something about a camel race. So here's where you come in, fellow history lover. The next time you're tempted to think of ancient civilizations as stoic and stiff, remember, Egypt once had a pharaoh who probably hosted karaoke night with his Libyan uncles. But this wasn't some dusty story of slow decline, it was a full-on sitcom with royal stakes. Like and share if you've ever had to juggle family drama, sudden promotions, or the stress of managing two cultures under one very sunburned roof. And if you think this was wild, just wait till the dynasties start fighting over which son gets to be the next feathered king.